Mayor Pete is surging. Can he win the Democratic primary? Can he pull liberals and moderates? How real is Mayor Pete? Well, joining us now, Noah Rothman, associate editor at Commentary Magazine, MSNBC, NBC News political contributor, and author of Unjust Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. Noah, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, no, pleasure is all ours. Well, the Democratic, my sense of looking at, you can tell me if you agree, my general sense of the Democrats is this. If 2016 is 1968, and it has a lot of parallels to that, I think that's Karl Rove's thesis. I will push that further and say that 2020 may have parallels to 72. And I know liberals don't want to hear that, but a lot of what happened after 1968, Democrats should have gone to the right, but instead they went way to the left. Is that what's happening now?
It very well could be. It's an interesting thesis. I heard a lot of people describe 68 or 16 as 68 in the cultural sense, if not the actual circumstances regarding kind of war and urban disorder that characterized that election. If 2020 is 72, that speaks well for Donald Trump, but not necessarily for 74.
Well, that's a good point. Well, that's true, too. I mean, it wouldn't be 72 because you're not going to win 49 states, right? I mean, a big victory would be 30 states would be phenomenal. So it's not, the times are different. But clearly, I mean, the Democrats are starting to move to the left, and they're cannibalizing each other, basically. I mean, this is now this is the wildest, wide open primary, I think, in American history. I don't remember just racing back through the 20th century. I remember nothing like this. But, okay, let's look at this. Okay, let's take Mayor Pete. Now, the appeal of him, I mean, obviously he's the first gay candidate, and maybe a lot of my friends on the right are saying that CNN and MSNBC want to make him president the way they pushed Obama in 2008 with the first black president. Now you have the first gay president. The establishment media wants that. He'll have the media behind him. He's already kind of pushed Beto out of the way as the star candidate. He's raising money hand over fist. He's taken a lot of Beto's operatives. And his greatest strength may be that he can attract both liberals and moderates, unlike some of these others like Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah, so he's an interesting candidate, Mayor Pete. He has sort of been able to thread the needle here by navigating the Democratic primary desires in a way, the Democratic primary electorate's desires in a way that satisfies everybody, but doesn't really hinder him in the general election. I mean, he's a married gay man. He's steadfastly refused, however, to engage in the Democratic Party's woke-off, this appeal to divisive identity politics that will have a deleterious effect on their capacity to attract voters that they need in the general election. Donald Trump's voters, for example, there's a real sotto voce debate within the Democratic electorate over whether it's morally compromising to attract and appeal to voters who voted for Donald Trump because they have such a low regard for voters, particularly ex-Democrats who crossed the aisle to vote for Donald Trump. They believe that appeal was rooted in racial animus. They really genuinely do. So they don't think that that's a morally viable path to winning the general election. But as
in 72, to press just to press my obsession here a little further, the challenge is very great for a Democrat because even if they don't want to, they have to race way far to the left, further than they would have ever done in recent years, further than Trump even has to race to the right. They've got to go way, way out to the left to get the nomination, and then they have to race all the way back. So it seems to me, if I were Mayor Pete's strategist, if I can throw off my Republican hat and put on the other side, I would think there are two big hurdles they've got to get over. One, they got to find a way to get the black vote as the primaries wrap through the South in the primaries. That's the biggest problem in the primaries that I see for him. And number two, in the general, although the country has changed, and although we have gay marriage, and although massive change in a lot of ways in the last 30 years, most of which is very good, I think, but he's still going to have to run away from gay in the general election if you want to win Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan, because I can tell you, being from that area, those states ain't that progressive yet. You agree those are his two hurdles?
He might. I'm not sure how. We just don't know. We don't know what the electorate's going to say to a homosexual candidate for a general election. It's never happened before. I'm hesitant to judge those circumstances because we just haven't tested it. To take your analogy a little bit further, the 1972 analogy, if these are McGovernites, I don't think that they're going to run away from the positions that they've adopted in the general election. These aren't positions that are arrived at because they are politically convenient or salient to a particular electorate. These are moral questions that they've embraced. The notion of a Green New Deal and all its sundry positions that it incorporates, including Medicare for all and free college and a minimum income for Americans and a federal jobs guarantee, all of those are framed in moral terms.
Well, that's the Dem base, though. What I'm talking about, that's the Democratic base. What I'm talking about for the general election question is, how do you go after swing voters in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and how do you peel back some of those blue-collar base Trump voters that Democrats want to win back with a gay candidate? You're talking about the base. I get that. He can hold the base, but how do you do that in those states? That's what I'm saying is his principal general election question.
Yeah, I don't, and I'm not entirely sure that. Well, Pete Buttigieg has declined to endorse a lot of these positions. Like he says, like everybody, that they love the Green New Deal, they just don't love what's in it. He has not embraced stuff like Medicare for all, so that's going to leave him in a better position, I suspect, than the far left candidates who would endorse that kind of position. The big problem here for Pete Buttigieg is, as you say, African American voters in the primary, and therefore in the general election. Most of those are reflexive Democratic voters, but you could see, as we saw in 2016, a lack of turnout in places that, for example, Hillary Clinton absolutely needed, in places like Michigan, in the urban areas of Michigan and Wisconsin, that would carry those states for Hillary Clinton. African American voters didn't jump out in droves to vote for Donald Trump. They just didn't show up at the polls. That is the kind of obstacle that a Pete Buttigieg candidacy.
Now, there's a lot. Let me ask you this before we get back into the Democratic primary thing. Do you think? Are you a House of Cards fan? Were you a House of Cards fan?
So I watched 2 seasons of it, and then I just kind of watched.
No, you got to watch. You got to watch the other 3. Don't watch season 6. You got to. Please, you have to. If you do anything in your life, do that. I'm telling you seriously. Anyway, in season 3, so you watch to the point where Frank becomes president. In season 3, Frank does something where the leadership Congress after he becomes president, he's weak, he's corrupt. They don't want him to run again. So first he says he's not running, and then he says he is running after he puts into place his jobs program, and of course he wins. It's the show. Now, I wonder, is Hillary pulling a Frank Underwood? Is she maybe what she did 4 months ago was the only thing she could do? Because she couldn't step back into the limelight. She would have been cannibalized along with some of these others, right? So maybe she's playing a game with us. What do you think?
Well, if I remember correctly, Maggie Haberman, who is connected to the Clinton world,
the New York Times, of the Times. New York Times.
Correct. She stressed that, I think I'm remembering this correctly, stressed that the people she was talking to were surprised by the media's reaction to Hillary Clinton's rather equivocal effort to take herself out of consideration. They didn't think that it was so unequivocal that the media pounced on it and said Hillary Clinton's not running. Apparently, Clinton world thought that she was going to be much more ambiguous about it, and it was not taken as ambiguous. It was a sort of Sherman-esque statement, but they didn't design it to be that way. So that would certainly suggest that while there's a desire on the part of Clinton's orbit to remain influential in the course of this primary process, that they are so inept at maintaining that influence that it's going to be rather muted.
It is, when you think about it, though, there are problems, because let's go back to the African American vote for a minute. Who can really get it? I mean, Kamala Harris. But then you get into the question of, will black men vote for a black woman? We don't have enough polling to know that. Single black women vote in very small numbers, except in Obama 08. Other than that, it's very small numbers. Married black women tend to vote as their husbands vote. Would a black man vote for a black woman? See, there's a lot of questions. Who can capture that black vote as the primaries wrap through the South? Maybe Biden could. I say that's a key question, don't you think?
It's a very key question, and I think there's a very big distinction between the sort of activist, Twitter active African-American progressives who populate, for example, the panels on MSNBC that I share with them, and the rest of the general electorate. The African-American vote is not nearly as progressive as the activist class is on social issues in particular, perhaps not economic issues, but certainly social issues, as you said.
Maybe a woman president.
Well, Kamala Harris has put a lot of chips into South Carolina. She's anticipating performing very well. South Carolina may be a make-or-break state for her. And if she comes out on top in South Carolina, she is well positioned to move into the following contests in big states that follow in the Super Tuesday states, where there are much larger populations of registered African-American Democrats who vote in primaries who could advance her candidacy down the road. The biggest threat to Democrats is the fact that they have such a scattered field of candidates. In 2016, we called it the clown car because of the number of Republicans in the race. Nobody's calling it that today because these are all Democrats.
They are Democrats. Yeah, it's funny, Noah.
But that is the threat. The threat is that everybody goes to the convention with a certain amount of pledged delegates, and nobody has enough to constitute a majority. And then you have to have a vote on the floor. In the couple minutes remaining here, let's talk about Jumpin' Joe Biden. Give me the analysis on Jumpin' Joe. Yeah, so I mean, it's hard to say. So he's run this very cautious campaign. I mean, he's been running for president for a while. Nobody subjects themselves to the kind of torturous scrutiny and the apology tour he's been on unless you're running for president. So he's been under the media microscope for a long time. The long knives are now out. The intersectionality left is now out for Joe Biden, in part because he's appealing to these voters that they're suspect of, these pro-Trump voters in the Midwest, and also because of his history on divisive racial issues. There's a piece in NPR today and one in the AP, both of which sort of couch criticisms of Joe Biden in the notion that supporting somebody who has those objectives and that history is really unwoke, is sort of an offense against progressive racial sensibilities. And that's something I expect to see, again, in very hushed terms.
But yet you say that. Now, I don't have polling data to support this. You say that, but yet my political instincts 30 years in D.C., and maybe they're not worth much on the Democratic side, but my instincts tell me that Biden would do well with the black vote in the South and would do well in a place like South Carolina. They say that's where my instincts are going, but maybe that's old time thinking.
No, I think you're 100% right. I think it's not captured in the conventional wisdom that is dominated by the progressive left in the Beltway, or in the Beltway and in the Acela corridor. The polls suggest that Joe Biden is performing especially well, if only because a lot of these voters, relatively low information voters who constitute the Democratic primary electorate, see Joe Biden as an extension of Barack Obama, the restoration of the status quo ante. They're not as attuned to these divisive racial issues. They're not voting on the 1994 crime bill or the Anita Hill hearings, which is what preoccupies the minds of the activist class in New York City and Washington, D.C. So I think they are missing the mark, and you've definitely put your finger on it.
Noah Rothman, associate editor, Commentary Magazine, NBC News political contributor, author, Unjust Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. Noah, if we're real lucky, we'll be able to have you back again. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Can the Democrats just not let go of Mueller, the Mueller report, and the whole Russian saga? Are they driving themselves into the political sewer with this obsession? Joining us now, Charles Lipson, Professor Emeritus of Political Science, University of Chicago, and a regular commentator, Real Clear Politics, Spectator USA, and Legal Insurrection. Charles, welcome.
My pleasure, Jack. How are you?
Well, very good, Professor. Pleasure to have you. Pleasure is ours. Let me ask you this. It looks like Democrats just can't let go of this Mueller thing. It's almost like I didn't realize how big Mueller had become in the Democratic constellation. He had become a kind of Jesus. He was their whole thing. With him gone, it's almost like they don't have a political raison d'etre, right?
I think that they've got a main issue independent of Mueller, and that's health care. I don't think they have their traditional employment issue unless there's a serious downturn in the economy over the next year. But Mueller's ambivalence on the issue of obstruction was intended to be a softball for the Democrats. I actually think, to switch metaphors, it's a trap. Not that Mueller intends it, but I think that if the Democrats go very far down that road, they're going to hurt themselves with the biggest constituencies they need.
You would think now the Democrats are just, I use the phrase for lack of a better one, double or triple screwed, because now first of all, they spend too much time with the whole Mueller thing that even if it worked out, those white working class voters in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin that they desperately need really don't care about that anyway. And so even if they'd won on that, it wouldn't be much of a victory, and I don't know that it would be much more would be happening now. But now it's a worst case scenario because they lost on the only thing they put real time into. The only thing that the House Democrats were prepared to do is impeach the president, so now they're fiddling with tax returns and executive privilege that people in key areas are completely tuned out on. It just seems to me, Pelosi, the Democrats are in trouble when people like Pelosi and Hillary Clinton become the voices of reason. Pelosi's now desperately trying to draw her flock back in to do some kind of infrastructure deal with Trump, but they won't do that because they're obsessed. Cummings and Nadler want the TV, and they're obsessed with another impeachment, and they're not going to let this thing go. I think this is the reason I say Democrat. It's 1972 all over again. I think this is worst case scenario for the Democratic Party. And then when you look into the field, I don't really see any good candidates.
Well, those are separate issues, but I think that, and I think you're right on both counts. I think that the problem that they have now is that they don't have a clear affirmative agenda. The Democrats don't. And I think that they step on their own message as they continue to pursue the Nadler Schiff, Maxine Waters, Tom Steyer type agenda of impeachment. And I think that you can see Trump, who is very shrewd about a lot of these things, sees that fighting them on it is actually to his advantage. That's why I think you see him now saying, we're going to resist every subpoena. He likes the idea of being a fighter. But don't underestimate the revulsion that a lot of voters have for Trump. Now, that is not seen within the Republican Party, right? He has, except for a few kind of moderate center-right Republicans, he's largely, and a few never-Trumpers, he's largely brought the Republican
Let's talk about that. That's
around.
That's a good question, though. Let's talk about that. You raise a good question. Let's talk about it more analytically. So since Election Day 2016, it would seem to me there are two truths, and you can tell me how they net out and if you agree.
Okay.
Truth number one is that there has been some growth in the Trump base. I think that's a fact. Truth number two is that he has lost, because of the shutdown and other things, he has clearly lost some of the swing voters that were attracted to him in 16. So there's a plus in one and a minus in the other. You think overall it's a net gain for the president or a net loss since November of 16?
I think it's a net gain, but I don't think that the loss is so much around the shutdown. I think the loss is around the crudity and the personality and the fact that he's just sort of hard to take for people. For the same reason that I think Democrats were initially sort of attracted to Beto, who was clearly just an empty suit. I think that Mayor Pete is not an empty suit, but I think that Mayor Pete will have different set of problems, not about being gay, but really about attracting the black vote, which is absolutely central to any Democratic victory.
One thing I've noticed with Trump, I mean, obviously this is a very bad time. This is the worst time for Democrats since the election of 16. It's probably the worst time in the last 6 or 7 years for Democratic Party overall in terms of their trajectory and their future. But one thing, and I'm sure this is what bothers the Donald, with Mueller in the limelight, Trump was able to capture the top of the news cycle every single day. And in fact, for something like the last 4 years, he dominated literally every single day of the news cycle, including Christmas, Easter, and everything else, without literally missing a day unless there was a massive terrorist attack somewhere. And even then, he managed to dominate it most of the time. Now, without Mueller, though, it would seem to me for the first time in 4 years, Trump is having some difficulty preempting all of the media oxygen in the room. That's a bit of a problem.
That's a very interesting point, Jack. I hadn't really understood it as clearly as I think you put it. I think that's a very smart point. I guess let me just say, I think that the investigations that are going to be into the last 2 years of the Obama-era Department of Justice, FBI, and intelligence agencies are going to come back in a very big way, and I think that Trump will be able to capitalize on those. But I think that and I think the point that's been missed here is that it puts Biden in a very difficult position. Either Biden is a big part of the Obama administration, which is kind of his main claim to fame, right? In which case he gets tarred by this. Right. Or he says, hey, I didn't know anything about it. In which case, how are you going to claim all the successes if you are so innocent of any of this other stuff?
I like the way you set that up. To that point, maybe he has to pull a Bill Clinton and run toward it and away from it at the same time. Maybe,
he's not that agile.
But he's not that agile. Okay.
Bill Clinton was one of the great politicians of our time when he was at his peak, right? I mean, he was always batting over 300.
Or 400.
Yeah, exactly. He was. People knew he was BSing you. He knew that you knew, and he could still pull it off. Right? It's amazing that Hillary was able to sit behind him for all those years and not have any of that rub off. But in any event, I think that Biden presents a number of problems in terms of his own candidacy. It's really hard to see. He just lacks that killer instinct. If he'd had it, he would have run instead of Hillary.
Let's take a look at Pelosi for a minute. I mean, Pelosi her job would be, I don't know if she'd be better off, but her job would be a lot easier had the Mueller report been at least somewhat damning of the president. Because at that point she could say, well, the committee chairmen are investigating, we're letting them go, I don't really have to do much, the ship is sailing on, and off we go. But now she knows that the whole thing is being perceived, even by the establishment media, as a joke. That is, even in the eyes of the New York Times, Democratic Party is becoming a big joke now. They're holding an empty bag. You know, the man behind the curtain is the Wizard of Oz. What does she do? Now she is desperately trying to corral crazies, and she realizes that as Speaker, suddenly she has very little power.
That's actually exactly on point. The real problem now is that parties are weak. You can tell that because Trump, who is clearly not a Republican insider, in fact, he was elected because he was an outsider, came in and defeated all the party insiders and has been able to take over the party. How has he been able to take over the party? Not by fundraising, really, although that will be powerful in the next round, but by proving to nearly all Republicans that if you are seen as not friendly enough to Trump, he can defeat you in a primary by backing your opponent. And that has clarified their minds, especially the victory in the Florida gubernatorial, where the front runner was just smashed, and also in Georgia, where the insider front runners were just smashed by Trump. I think Nancy Pelosi cannot overrule the AOCs and all the rest, because just like Trump, they have a direct avenue to voters. They can use Twitter, they can get on TV, they can do all the rest. I think that those people will be injured by the mainstream media, who are clearly in the Democratic Party.
Let me ask you this: let me ask you this:
and will not want to hurt the party by giving AOC more press than she deserves.
Let me ask you this: you mentioned Twitter. Now, Donald Trump, for all his crudities, is, I think, very sophisticated in some of his understandings of politics. I'm sure you agree. Twitter, he used Twitter, he made Twitter the big thing in 2016. Twitter, though, in some sense is becoming blasé. Do you see the Donald as looking for the new toy for the 2020 election?
I don't know, but boy, he's got a good team that he's put together, led by the person who did all of his data analysis in the last round. What you have to recognize is that Trump ran it as a kind of jerry-built operation the first time around. Now he's got a lot of money and a coherent group. I want to say one more thing about Nancy Pelosi.
Please.
Nancy Pelosi, but more importantly, all those centrist, center-left Democrats who won in places like rural Pennsylvania, they're going to have a problem. And it's not just about all the Nadler Schiff sucking up all the oxygen. What are they going to run on that a Democratic Congress has accomplished? Trump is going to go in and say, look, when the Democrats were in charge, we got no legislation through. All they wanted to do is obstruct. If you vote in a Republican Congress, they can work with our Republican Senate, and we can accomplish something. And I think that's going to pose real issues in the House. Now, I don't know yet about how the Senate looks, but holding the Senate is not an absolutely sure thing either for the Republicans. But I think the fact that the House has accomplished nothing other than sort of obstructing Trump will pose a real problem for center-left Democrats.
Charles Lipson, professor. I wish we could go on and on for hours. I'm sure we could. Charles Lipson, ladies and gentlemen, professor emeritus, political science, University of Chicago, regular commentator, Real Clear Politics, Spectator USA, Legal Insurrection. Professor, we'd love to have you back. Thank you so much.
A real pleasure, Jack. Thank you.
How many Democrats will vote for Trump in 2020? Did you know there were a lot of Bernie supporters who voted for Trump last time around? Bet you didn't know that. That's coming up in a minute. But now, on Behind the Curtain, we take your questions just like we do every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoon. This is how you become part of the process. Let's get right to it. Lois in Boise, Idaho. I'm seeing a lot of talk, Lois writes, about the White House telling the committees looking at the Mueller report that the president will use executive privilege to keep aides from testifying about obstruction and to conceal the tax returns. What do you think? It'll be tough. Executive privilege may work on the obstruction thing with some of the aides. On the tax returns, it can be tough. A lot of the question will be, what is the right of Congress to put the tax return of a private person? And that's what Trump is in this case out there. I'm not sure executive privilege is even the battle. I'm not sure that's even the right battlefront for the issue of tax returns. The issue of tax returns will really be a case of first impression for the Supreme Court. They're going to have to take a look at the tax code. They're going to have to take a look at privacy law, maybe a little bit on executive privilege, but that one's going to be complicated. Okay, go to BehindTheCurtainRadio.com. Hit the podcast button, get the podcast, jump into the ring, square off. We need you in these polls. We need to know what you think. If you're on YouTube, hit that bell. Don't forget. Marcus in Key West. We've had you before, Marcus. Marcus says, I just read in an Emerson poll that 12% of Bernie supporters voted for Trump in 2016 because they're upset with the DNC. Do we think this will happen again? You know, Marcus, that's a very good point. In fact, it may be the case, and political scientists are studying this now, that 12% is what won the election. What won the election for Donald Trump? Now, you may remember that in a bipartisan act, on behalf of Bernie supporters 6 months ago, we filed suit against the DNC in connection with the Seth Rich matter to get all of these records out. And we had a lot of Bernie supporters. It was a very bipartisan effort. It failed. We lost the case on a technicality. But I'll tell you, Bernie supporters are willing to, I give them credit, they're open-minded. Now, why can Trump win Bernie supporters? Well, one, you have the massive hatred because of what the DNC did to Bernie. It was rigged. Hillary rigged it, all that. They hate the Democratic National Committee. Now, beyond that, though, there's a substantive reason, and that is that the Donald is bringing jobs back to America in some sense just like Bernie does. In fact, one of the big problems for Bernie and the Democrats is that Trump has effectively hijacked the agenda. Now, if Bernie supporters are such a big deal to Trump, though, if you're Donald Trump, maybe the person you have to be most afraid of in the general is Bernie. And not a lot of people talk about Bernie as being a general election candidate because secretly they don't think he can get the nomination. But maybe Bernie is the Democrat to watch, even though he doesn't look the part, doesn't look like a traditional candidate. Maybe times have changed. Frank in San Antonio writes, Elizabeth Warren finally stepped off the ledge. Oh, she went off the ledge a long time ago, Frank, and promised free college tuition. Are people that stupid to think it's actually free? Is the electorate really that dumb? Well, I don't know if it's the electorate. I think kids are. You remember Jenkins Fox, a beautiful young girl we used to have when she was in college, used to come and be on the show. She was a big liberal Bernie supporter. I said, Jenkins, what do you like about, tell me, what do kids, 20-year-olds like you, what do they like about Bernie? And she said, I said, what is it? Is it gay rights? Is it the environment? Is it the economy? She said, no, it's none of those things. It's free college. It's free college. So kids, I don't know if kids believe it. Kids want to believe it. I don't think anybody else believes it. I don't think that kind of socialism is a winning pitch in our country. All right, hit the like button. Go to the website, behindthecurtainradio.com. Get that podcast. Do it now. I want you to do it right now. Oh, Eric in Seattle. Eric writes, Mitt Romney, we forgot about him. Eric says, what is Mitt Romney's deal? Do you think he still wants to be president, or is he just playing spoiler for Trump? Why is he still around? Well, sadly, the people of Utah have elected him to the United States Senate. Why they did that, I have no idea. There's nothing in politics I hate worse than a state switcher. State switchers are... I really, there's nothing worse than a person that goes to Boston. Mitt Romney's essentially from Michigan. That's where he grew up. Then he goes to Boston and says, I love Massachusetts. I'm from here. My whole life is the people of Boston. Vote for me. So they elect him governor. Then after that, he runs for president. Then he darts back out west and he says, my whole life is Utah. These are my Mormon roots. Vote for me. And the people of Utah, I guess they're dumb or something. They voted for him. I have no idea why. BehindTheCurtainRadio.com. Get the podcast, jump into the ring, square off, hit that like button. Remember, if you like this is but a foretaste of the feast to come on Behind the Curtain. See you next time.